chair of the Global Black Caucus.
And I'm Adrienne. I lead our caucus's Get Out the Vote team.
Welcome to the Power to the People podcast.
2025, and we're in our season of opposition.
And we will not obey in advance. Power to the people. Welcome, everyone, to Unpacking DEI and why it's everyone's fight. This past 30 days or so has been kind of rough. And one of Trump's first things to do was to eliminate DEI because because he's a racist and a sexist. But also, I don't believe that he or many people know what it really means. And it's not just, like so that people of color and women can just be put over white men. That's not exactly what it's about. Our guest today is Dr. Robert Scott, and he is retired from the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel after 20 years of service. He taught for the University of Maryland's Global Campus in Europe for 19 years and the Schiller International University for 7 years. Upon retirement, he taught mathematics at the International School of Business in Heidelberg, and now he is an adjunct professor teaching statistics online for Howard University. Dr. Scott studied at South Carolina State University, Arizona State University, and Boston University. And he's been affiliated with Democrats Abroad, Germany, since 2005. And it is my honor and privilege to turn the floor over to you, Dr. Scott.
Good evening. I'll try to make this as interesting as possible. I'm not sure how, Angela, you want to handle question. I assume questions for the most part will be at the end, but if there's a burning issue and you just have to ask a question, how do you want them to do it? Raise their hand or?
Well, if you just put it in the Q&A box, that would be great. And then I'll, because this is kind of a small audience, I will maybe pull you out of the audience and let you speak and ask your own question. But put that you want to speak in the Q&A box and what you want to talk about. So feel free to begin your slides.
Okay. What I'm going to do, I'm going to try to take you through a process, and the first part of the process will be that I've skipped slides. I'm going to try to take you through some definitions because some of what I've heard recently when it comes to DEI, I certainly don't recognize what they're talking about. So to make certain that we're all on the same sheet of music, I'm going to put up some traditional definitions. I'm going to talk after defining a few things. I'm going to talk about my experience with DEI when it was in its inception, because I'm probably a day or two older than most of you. And when I first got affiliated, it wasn't even called DEI, and I'll talk a little about that. And then I would like to list some of the things that's happening now, and then to finish it up, basically talk about where we should go from here or how we should attempt to attack this whole thing. Now, I think as you look at traditional definitions, I don't think there's anything on the screen that will bother any of you who are here listening to me tonight or today, depending on where you are. When we look at equity, number 2, of course, doesn't apply to what we're talking about. But as far as diversity is concerned, I would think 1 and 2 would not disturb most people around the world. And inclusion, I certainly think it's something that we should all strive for and want to have happen. but for some reason, there are people who get so upset at the thought of DEI that I guess they go crazy. Now, let's talk a little about the description that the Department of Defense uses when it comes to what's to be covered under DEI. Okay? Is it changing for everybody? Does it seem to be okay?
Yeah, I think it's changing. Just
Okay. I thought this was catchy. I was watching the Grammys, and Alicia Keys, I thought summed it up. So I thought I would just bring this along. Next slide, please. When I started speaking originally, I talked about the fact that there are conventional definitions for all of the words that are involved in DEI, and I mentioned that under equity, number two doesn't apply to what we're doing, but all of the other information on the slide applies. And in all honesty, I don't see why anybody would be upset about anything that's envisioned here. Next slide. The Department of Defense goes into detail about exactly what they would like to have or what must be in the program, what should be in the program, as was defined and written by Lisa Dunn here. And as Angela stated, a lot of people, when they hear or see DEI, the first thing they think of are Black people or women. And when the president made his pronouncement after, in the middle of this great tragedy in Washington, D.C., and he said, "Oh, the accident was because of DEI." The first thoughts that came to my mind was, I guess the one of the chopper pilots must be a woman or Black or possibly both. And the reason that I jumped to those conclusions because he was there with the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense by that time knew who was on the helicopter. And when they came out with their pronouncements, I figured they saw something that would allow one to jump to such a conclusion, which, is an idiotic conclusion, but they did anyhow. Okay, next slide. The Department of Defense, again, as they described their DEI program, they point out that one of the groups that they're very, very concerned about are people with disabilities. And there are lots of folks, ex-military folks, who work for DOD that have disabilities. And a big part of the program is to make sure that they are treated fairly and that they are included in the process. Like I said, typically folks on the right tend to think that if it's DEI, it's about blacks and women. Next slide. Now, when it's not DEI, folks are complaining that the reason we lost the last election and the reason things have gone so far awry is because of this thing, woke. And since there is a definition in the Black community, and obviously outside of the Black community, folks are having difficulties understanding what woke means. So it strictly means basically to be awake and aware of the things happening and going on around you. So again, why folks would be so upset about the word woke is beyond me. I heard a Democrat within recent days said, as we assess what happened to us so we can get back on the right track, we have to be aware of the fact that, we did go too far with woke, whatever that means. Next slide. I had to throw something in about CRT because, um, in addition to being upset about DEI, woke, CRT comes up, and folks have decided that CRT is whatever they want it to be. It has nothing to do with uh, what it was, the reason it came into existence to begin with. The essence of CRT has to do with a group of people in a seminar at Harvard University in the 70s. And basically, what they were doing, they were critiquing some of the cases, the court cases that had gone before about Brown versus Board of Education. And their primary concern was this: if you can fix the situation for individuals, the question was, does that fix the systemic problems that exist in things like housing? Housing segregation in the country was actually directed when redlining was a part of the process and folks couldn't get money to buy homes if they were in a certain district. And this in turn caused the housing situation in many cities to be segregated the way it is today. And what they were concerned about was, if you help individuals do better, will that change the overall housing situation? And another thing they were debating was the criminal justice system. There are things embedded in the criminal justice system, like people getting more time for crack cocaine than for other drugs that were comparable. And the reason that this was believed to be the case was most of the people being caught with crack were black, and their sentences seemed to be much more severe. And the other thing that they debated was just the legacy of enslavement itself. What kind of things needed to be done to break the mold or to change what had happened to people for so many years to cause the situation to be better. And this is what they were debating. Next slide. Dr. Derek Bell was a law professor at Harvard, and the other two names you see here and others were students in the seminar. And like I said, the discussions that they were discussing, first of all, CTR was for law students and how they could change the structure of the laws that existed. It had nothing to do with trying to teach these things to K through 12 level students. Um, Again, like I said, it's a law level concept, and it has been taken off totally off the track. And folks will argue with you today that it's being taught in high school or in elementary school. It was never taught at any of those levels. Now, history is not theory. History is not theory. And what was being done at Harvard was theoretical. That's all it was. The reason that people got upset in high school and elementary school was some teachers were saying, we need to teach a history that's more inclusive so that all students can have an appreciation for their backgrounds. And when that was introduced in certain states, folks got upset, started calling it CRT, and it wasn't CRT. It was plainly and purely history that folks wanted to teach as an inclusive subject. Next slide. So the conservative view of CRT is basically any time or anything you hate about race, we attribute it to CRT, therefore, you can get a rise out of folks. This guy, Christopher Rufo, was very instrumental in a lot of what happened in Florida when the governor decided that, he wasn't going to allow Black history to be taught in schools. he wasn't going to allow anything to be taught about LBGTQ situations or discussions, wasn't going to allow these things in the classroom. And Rufo kind of came on the scene during that period. And he readily admitted up front that his objective was to turn CRT into letters that would make Republicans angry. Just hearing CRT would cause them to go off. And what I've concluded is he did a hell of a job of that, because that's exactly what's happening now. Folks hear CRT, they have no idea what it's about, except they're putting the word out that it teaches kids to be to be angry at other kids, or it teaches one group to be upset about another group. And like I said, that has nothing to do with it. The teachers that wanted to teach inclusive history just said the history that we teach should be history, and it shouldn't cause one group or another to feel bad or to feel good or to do anything other than understand what is happening with history. Now, that might naturally happen, but because it happens, it doesn't mean that history should not be taught. Should we only teach the things that make us look good? I assume that's what is going to be happening in Florida and a lot of other states. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about um, the situation primarily from a military perspective, because my first 20 years out of school, I was in the military. And defense, the Defense Race Relations Institute was instrumental in teaching me a lot that I know about race relations and inclusivity. And so I'm going to look at it from that perspective. In 1948, President Truman passed or signed the Executive Order 9981, and it basically integrated or desegregated the service, and it also allowed women to be in the various branches of the service as opposed to being in separate entities. The Korean War was the first war that African Americans fought as a part of integrated units. All wars prior to that, if there were black units, they were separate. And through the end of World War II, the black units, for the most part, well, no, that's not true. In the Civil War, the black units were led strictly by white officers. It was only in World War II and after that there were black officers leading black units. Next slide. Out of the civil rights struggle came two very important bills. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. There was a Civil Rights Act of 1957 that most people probably are not aware of or don't remember, but there was a Civil Rights Act of 1957. A lot of things didn't happen after that act, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. The 1965 voting right was important because my parents, in their lifetime, up until 1965, were never allowed to vote in any elections with us living in the South. Next slide. Even though Brown versus Board of Education was 1954, when I graduated from high school in 1964, all of the schools around Charleston, South Carolina, were still segregated 10 years after the fact. Now, if you look in the history books, what you'll find is it stated that in 1963, schools in South Carolina or in Charleston were desegregated, but that's not totally true. 15 students in the city of Charleston filed a court suit to be allowed to go to schools closer to their homes, and they won the right to do that. Some of those 15 students attended what previously had been white schools, but There wasn't a single school in Charleston County in 1964 that was integrated. As a matter of fact, I went away to college, and when I came back in 1968 on James Island, where I grew up, just outside of the city of Charleston, the two schools on James Island still were not integrated. I, my experience was a segregated experience, both in high school and at the HBCU that I attended in college. After college, or well, actually, while in college, I was in the ROTC program, and the first integrated environment that I ever operated in was at ROTC summer camp in 1967. Next slide. What I what I tried to do here was give you a feel for what the military, especially the Army, was like in 1968. There were a total of 2,079,142 folks on active duty at that point in time. 1.5 million of them were in the Army. The total officers' corps was over 400,000, 400,700, 925. African Americans made up about 2% of the overall military forces. There were 8,325 African Americans in the military in 1968. What I was unable to get was the exact number that was in the Army because I couldn't get the officer figures, the Army officers' figures. The figures you see here represents the total force. There were approximately 11,000 women serving in Vietnam over the 20-year period. 90% of them were nurses. There were women in other parts of the military in clerical work and other work, but they were not allowed to be in combat units at the time that I came in 1968. Next slide. As I stated, ROTC summer camp was the first time I was in an integrated classroom or unit in my life. In May of 1968, I was commissioned a second lieutenant and reported to active duty at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. After signing in, I was told to go find housing and get myself settled. I was not going to be at Fort Jackson for a long period of time. It was just the holding station until I went off to officers basic course. But Fort Jackson was like 30 miles from where I went to school, where I went to college. So this was the assignment they sent me to. So after signing in, getting some appointments, I was told, go find yourself a place to live. I was newly married and I went out to get an apartment. Outside the gate were a number of nice apartment complexes. I went to the first, the sign said vacancy. I stepped up to the desk and was told there were no apartments available. So I went to another complex. Same thing. When I got to the third and the guy said to me there was nothing available, I said to him, if you have nothing available, why don't you turn off your vacancy sign? Why are you saying you have vacancies if you don't? And he looked at me, and I guess he thought about it for a while because he realized, because I said, this is the third place I've been to. And he said to me, you know that you're wasting your time. Nobody around here is going to rent to you. And I was shocked because this is outside of a military installation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had passed, and I thought things had changed, but they hadn't. But I knew I could take care of this. It wasn't going to be a big deal. I went into the housing office on base, and I just knew they were going to tell these people, you have to rent to this lieutenant. You can't deny him. The lady in the housing office told me, there's nothing I can do. I'm sorry. And I said, but it's against the law. She said, well, you can file a lawsuit. How long are you going to be at Fort Jackson? I said, 6 months. She said, well, you won't get housing before you leave if you file a suit, because it's just not going to happen that fast and there's nothing we can do about it. What was extraordinary to me was this was a military installation, this was a government installation. They knew what the law was, but yet they would put no pressure on the individuals to cause them to act the way they were supposed to. The last bit of advice that was given to me by the last place that I went was, you need to go into the Black community and try to find yourself a place to live, because nobody around here is going to rent to you. And he was right. I had to go into the Black community, rented a room in a lady's house because there weren't any apartments to rent. And that's where I stayed for my first 6 months in the military prior to leaving there. Now, I'm giving you these numbers that have to do with number of Black offices, and I'm doing this for a particular reason, which you will see a little later. When I went to my first assignment there at Fort Jackson, it was a basic training battalion. Basic training battalions had between 500 and 750 people. There were 3 Black officers. The battalion commander was Black, the S3 was Black, and me. I was the only Black training officer in my battalion. After I left Fort Jackson in October of 1968, I went to the officers' basic course. There were 3 Blacks in the officers' basic course. This number was coming up quite often. I thought maybe this was going to be the only number I would see. There were 2 other Black officers and myself in my basic course. When I went to my first unit in Schweinfurt, Germany, well, the battalion headquarters was in Schweinfurt. I was in a battery in Bamberg. I was the only Black officer in the battalion. While I was in Germany, the latter part of my stay, there was racial tension in the units on base and off base. I called them racial disturbances, but there were individuals who described them as being riots. And I'm going to talk a little more about that situation in a minute, which will lead me into the DEI stuff in particular. I left Germany and went to Vietnam in 1971. I was in a support command headquarters in Da Nang. Again, there were 3 Black officers, myself and 2 others. Thank you. Next slide. I present this statement to you to kind of give you a feel for when the Army got involved with trying to change the race relations situation. As I described to you earlier, there were tense situations in Germany, and basically they were brought about by the fact that many students or many soldiers, sorry, not students, many soldiers were returning from Vietnam. And when they came back to the States, they met demonstrations in the States, anti-war folks. When they came over to Germany, they felt that they were being discriminated against on the base, and there were problems when they went off base. And the problem off base was there was segregation when it came to the bars and clubs that soldiers went to. It was a self-segregation process. The Germans didn't decide that we don't want Blacks in a particular place, but white soldiers decided we're going to go to these bars and clubs, and we don't appreciate it if you show up at the same place. So if Blacks showed up at places that were traditionally considered to be white, there would be fights, and that information would get back on base. But there were just a lot of tension and problems in the late 60s and early 70s in Germany. So the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense made the statement that folks basically had to learn something about race relations and how to work with people. And if you couldn't or didn't learn, then you couldn't be a leader in the military. And he went on to say there were situations that led to 10 to 12 military officers from general officer down to company grade who were either transferred, lost their commands, or some disciplinary action because they couldn't or didn't handle the racial tension that was happening at the time. Next slide. In 1971, I will say the Army reacts fairly quickly. With all the problems that were coming out of Germany, the Department of Defense decided that they needed to put a task force together and come up with a way to deal with and remedy the situation that we were confronting in Germany. Out of that came what was called the Defense Race Relations Institute down at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida. And it was the forerunner to what the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute, which was the second. First, it was DRI, then DEOMI. And that's where race relations training started in the Department of Defense. And this was in 1971. The individual who started or who was put in charge of putting together this program, Kurt Smothers, I happened to meet him when I was at the Defense Race Relations Institute in 1973. When I met Kurt, he told me what had happened to him. He was a JAG officer in Heidelberg, and he was acting as a judge when a task force came over from the States to inquire what's going on racially here. Why do we have all of these tension, or why do we have all of this tension? He said to them, things just aren't the way they should be. And when he was asked, what do you mean by that? He said, black soldiers don't feel that they're a part of the unit. They feel they're being discriminated against, and they don't appreciate it. So they're getting into a lot of fights. They're being rebellious with the leadership, and that's what's causing the problem. So he was asked, well, what do we need to do to fix that? And he said, you need to develop and have some kind of sensitivity training because you have many of these soldiers coming out of the South. They've never been in an integrated environment before in their lives. And if you don't do something to ameliorate the situation, it's really going to be difficult. So they decided, after going back to Washington talking about it, since this young captain thinks that he knows what needs to be done, we're going to offer him the job of doing it. So one day, Kurt is a captain. The next day, he is an SES, whatever level they gave him. And he was told, put together a program that will make this situation better. And Kurt sat down, pretty much put together the program for DRI, and it was a program that worked quite well while I was in the military. As I stated, in 1973, I attended the Race Relations Institute, and basically what the program did, it had some Black history, and basically it was a lot of communicating, sitting around in small groups and people talking to each other, because one of the things that Kurt said was, blacks and whites don't know how to talk to each other. They don't know how to talk about race. One of the complaints that came up, I remember one day in the seminar I was in, this white soldier asked the question. He said, why do blacks stand in the chow line, dapping and holding up the chow line? And if we try to go around, they want to fight. And, what's going on there? And a black person in the room said, I do it just to piss you off. And the white soldier said, what do you mean by that? He said, all of my life, you've done a lot of things to piss me off because you could do it. And he said, now I feel like pissing you off. And we stand there and we dap just to piss you off. Well, there was a lengthy discussion about whether that should or shouldn't be done. And by the end of the session, it was pretty much resolved and the two soldiers were talking to each other. But prior to that, I think it would have been difficult for them to carry on any kind of conversation. Next slide. Okay, I bring this slide up to show that the Army was very responsive. The first bullet has nothing to do with being responsive. I just thought I would throw in the first um, Black to graduate from West Point was in 1877, 75 years after the school was started. And he was Henry O. Flipper. This was the first Black officer to graduate from West Point. The next three bullets are the ones that I think are important. After what was happening out in the Army happened, the military decided that something needed to be done to make West Point a more inclusive place. And what they discovered was from the beginning of the institution until 1974, there had never been an African American to teach physics at West Point, 170 years after the institution started. There had never been an African American to teach chemistry, and there had never been an African American to teach mathematics. The decision was made. The individual was brought in for chemistry in 1972. In 1976, both a chemistry and a math person came into the academy. So after the temperature was taken, the people in charge decided to take some action and things did start moving. Okay, next slide. Presently, in the active component of the Army, it's 84% male, about 16% female. Whites that who are not Hispanic, roughly 54%. Blacks constitute about 20%, Hispanic 18%, Asian about 6.9%, and Native American about 1%. Next slide. Now, this slide I've put in the presentation because a lot of people are saying at this point it's reverse racism. DEI has gone so far that jobs are being taken from white folks. This is 1923. I'm sorry. 2023, not 1923. This is 2023, these statistics. What you see in parentheses is the percentage of individuals in that particular category on active duty. So 20% of women officers, 20% of the people on active duty are female officers, but only 15.7% are women on active duty of the total forces. So there's a greater percentage of women officers than the overall percentage of women in the military. Whites, 53.6% of the military, but 69% of the officers' corps, white. Blacks that are not Hispanic makes up 20% of the service, but only 11% of the officers' corps. Now, if you remember when I came in, of the overall officers' corps, it was about 2%. At that point, it was about 5% of the officers' corps was black. 2% overall, 5% of the Army's officers' corps was black. The number now is about 11%, which is an improvement. Progress is being made. In the case of Hispanics, 17% of the force, only 9% of the officers' corps. The only group that's over other than female and whites, Asian, about 7%, but it makes up 8% of the officers' corps, and Native and Alaskan Natives, about 1% and 1%. Thank you. Next slide. Okay. I made these slides because when the MAGA folks talk, I'm not sure what they're talking about when they say, make America great again. So I looked at a number of periods throughout history because I'm trying to figure out what period are they talking about that they feel that America was great. I'm sure the Native Americans or Indigenous Americans thought the period prior to 1492 was great. After that, I'm not sure, where they might come down on that. But this was just to try to figure out what period are we talking about when MAGA says make America great again. Next slide. This is just a continuation of that. And maybe this is something during the discussion period we can talk about. What is this period when America was so great? Because from my point of view, the greatest time that I had in America was after 1968, from 1968 to present. All of the times before that wasn't such a great time for me or my relatives. Next slide. Okay. What happened when the Supreme Court decided the playing field is level? There is no need to be giving any kind of assistance to the admission of minorities to prestigious institutions. I let you just look at the numbers for a minute. Highly selective schools, after the Supreme Court decision, this is what happened. The first year after the decision. Next slide. At HBCUs, this is what happened. Applications went up like mad. And the question at hand was, why did this happen? Did more Black students decide that, since the courts said that there wasn't going to be any consideration based on race, was it just better to apply to an HBCU? Or did some students just decide that they don't want me at their school anyhow, so I might as well go to a place where I'll be accepted and perhaps is wanted? I don't know what the answer is to that question, but prestigious schools, Black enrollments went down considerably. At HBCUs, applications went up unbelievably. Next slide. Here are some of the things that the president has done in the last month. These are some of the directives and executive orders that he's issued. There are people in the military who are petrified. They have no idea what's coming because they're not allowed to celebrate ethnic months anymore. And all of the literature that they had up and available that did that, they had to immediately take down because the Secretary of Defense was coming to Europe and they were nervous as hell that something might be seen that shouldn't be seen and they were going to be in trouble. Civilians, they're nervous as hell because they don't know what's going to happen to them either. This last month, I think we can safely say, has been a month of turmoil. Next slide. So what do we have? From 1619 to 1964, 345 years, Blacks in the country have either been under slavery or Jim Crow. From 1964 until 2025, about 60 years, there has been some slow progress. But yet there are a lot of people who are saying 345 years worth of harm has been fixed or overcorrected in 60 years. I don't think so. Next slide. People are afraid. They don't know what they should do. Some of us sitting in the room tonight, I'm sure, not certain what we should do. My attitude is we have to fight like hell. I was in the streets in the 60s, and we may have come to a situation where we need to be in the streets again. Now, yes, my presentation was heavily toward the African American side of DEI, because as I stated to you from the beginning, that's what I know, that's what I've seen progress, and that's what I've experienced in the last month that it appears that people are trying to undo. And I think people have fought too hard in the past, my ancestors, yours, to where we can just sit around and say, well, this is okay. We'll get through the next 4 years and we'll get back to wherever. Well, the problem is, I don't think we know how much damage will have been done after 4 years. At this point, I would like to open it up for question and discussion, that we can talk about some of the stuff that I talked about or anything that you might be interested in talking about.
Hey, thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. It's a lot of history that I did not know.
Not in the history books. Some of these things we have to just talk about.
Yeah, this is true. Does anyone have any questions? No? Silence? If you have a question, why don't you raise your hand and we'll let you. Um, okay, Sarah has a question. She says, "Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for sharing your personal story. My question is, what can we do?"
Well, I think it's going to be an individual thing. Sitting here in Germany, it's going to be hard for us to go out into the streets because, the Germans, our fight isn't with the Germans. So I personally have become more active with certain of the groups stateside that that give money to and help to organize activities. I have told people that I know who live in the States, they really need to think about and start planning and talking to older people who were involved in going into the streets in the 60s, because back then, if we had a month like we just had, there's no question what we'd be doing. We'd be in the streets marching, and we'd be doing it at every opportunity that's presented. So I think it's going to have to be sort of an individual thing as to how you feel you can be most effective, but find something to do and try to do it. Because if we sit around and accept what's happening like it's okay, then I think things are going to get a lot worse. And the reason I say that is this. Can you imagine being one of these people who a few weeks ago had work, thought they were doing a good job, and now all of a sudden they find themselves unemployed? Anybody who would do that, to me, seemed to lack humanity. Because if you're the richest person or one of the richest persons in the world, and you stop feeding people who are starving, I don't understand that mentality. I don't understand it at all unless you just don't care or you're a hateful person. So find something. do something, right? Your congressperson, give money to some organization that you feel might be um, active and able to do something. And I don't have the answer. I don't know exactly what should be done, but we need to do something.
Well, I'm gonna put a little list of things that people can do in the chat. Um, it's just a list of things that I've compiled over the past, I don't know how many days, weeks, whatever. Um, Definitely, I know it seems like not something, it's not effective, but please contact your representatives, your two senators and your one person in the House of Representatives. They need to understand, even if they aren't seeming responsive at the moment, um, they need to know because, they are, Trump doesn't have to get elected again, but they do. One of the things, there's a couple of things on here that I know that people are going to probably say, oh, that's just the standard stuff. But on the list, get involved with Democrats abroad. Right now, almost every country committee and all the regions and even at global will be having elections. And maybe you don't want to maybe you don't want to run you don't want to be an officer or run for something, but you can still get involved. We need every person to do something at this point. There's more work than what is than the number of people, and we need new ideas. We need new thoughts. One of the things that I have on my list, which might seem a little bit it might be difficult for some people, but the idea of becoming like a mini influencer, if you're not already like a major influencer, I don't know how much of a following people have, but um, I have been, I, one of the, I, so I've been making videos every day about the situation, because the other thing that we need to do is make sure all of our friends and family that are in America, or people, Americans outside of America, understand the situation. Because the more people that understand, the more people that take action, even if it's a tiny action, it makes a big difference. Um, Try some of the things on the list, see what happens. We're going to be having on International Women's Day, which is it's March 8th. There's going to be protest all around the world. And if you can join in with your country committee, if you live in a place that, you can actually march or demonstrate. Um, People have been demonstrating all over the United States for quite some time. And even when the new Secretary of Defense came, we had protest in Germany, we had protest, I think it was Belgium, and somewhere else there were protests where he went. We're also, if you live in a place where there's not the ability to protest, we're having a resistance event that's actually it's turning out to be a all day event, so it doesn't really matter. We're going to be bringing some of the people in online that are out protesting, so you can, and we're going to bring some people in from the States too, from other places around the world. Hopefully we're going to have some speakers that can maybe give us some more concrete items to do. Um, and yeah, you just have to do something. Also, in this list of things that I put, there are some suggestions, a place to put suggestions. If you have an idea, then send it in, because this is a situation that Americans haven't really been in a long, or if ever, um, maybe not since the Revolutionary War, but we were the ones fighting the tyrant we weren't being, it's not exactly the same as the Revolutionary War. We have another question. Um, so this is says, I recently listened to another speaker who discussed how we cannot attack this from the position of hate. It has to be from a position of love. Do you have any thoughts of what that looks like?
Well, back in the 60s when Dr. Martin Luther King gave his speeches and gave direction and folks followed him, um, there was never, I don't think, people were operating from a position of hate at all. As a matter of fact, there were a lot of people who were bothered by the fact that Dr. King said, it's going to be peaceful. And if you got hit, you were basically supposed to turn the other cheek. And, that was pretty successful, although some of the younger folks who were involved in the movement at the time didn't appreciate that. And their attitude was, if somebody hits me, I'm going to hit them back. Now, it doesn't have to be a physical thing. And I mean, we can do a lot of things, that's really not hateful. We're basically just trying to defend, our position or our feelings. I mean, there are a lot of things we can do. It doesn't have to be hateful. And I don't feel in any of the marches and demonstrations that I participated in that most of the people were hateful at all. We were trying to get changes, and to do that, sometimes you put yourself in harm's way, but that's the way it goes. I'm not telling anybody to go out and buy weapons and start shooting at people. That's not what I mean by fight. We have to fight in the ways that Angela was describing, some of the things that she has listed, and just in whatever way we can come up with to cause and to make change.
Yeah, there's a there's a question in the Q&A, which how how can you explain that there were blacks who voted for Trump? Um, I don't know if you want to take that one or should I?
But please, why don't you start? I'll pick up.
Well, okay. You know, one of the reasons that there were unusual to me, an unusual amount of blacks that voted for Trump is because they're under the same influence that all the rest of these people are on and that are Trump people. I was just telling Robert, or he saw on my Facebook page, that I have a person, an African American friend. Actually, I have more than one that likes Trump. It's totally weird, people that I've grown up with. But I think the main reason why people of color in general voted for Trump is because they don't want to be seen as Black or Hispanic, or they think that they're not like all the rest of us. And this is this is the main reason. Yeah, we're not a monolithic group, but the thing is for me, it, it's you know, when you if you listen to what Trump said and somehow you can parse out that he wasn't speaking about me in this what in his racist sexist rants, then you really want to separate yourself from the rest of people. I saw a video the other day, and it was a woman, oh, what from Colombia, and she was one of these people, the Latinos for Trump, and it was a video where she was like, "Yay, we won, woohoo!" And then like after the election, after he was inaugurated, they started picking up Colombians, and then she was like, I don't understand this. I don't understand why he's doing this, you know? And it's like you imagined yourself different from the rest of the group of people that you are support. Yes, and it's also a lot of sexism too. That was it. Robert, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I would say, there are lots of reasons why people probably did what they did. There are some people who have this vision that Trump being rich is something that can happen to them if they are loyal disciples. I'm not sure,
Yes.
that that's even close to being realistic, but I think it's a view that's out there because, there are some black folks that I have talked to who that's their attitude. They say they think they stand a much better chance of getting ahead in this world if they follow somebody like Trump than the typical Democrat, is what they have said to me. And the response or the what they mean or what they think they mean by the typical Democrat, they say we elected Obama and Obama did nothing for us. And when I tried to come with the counter, Obama was in a box also. He tried to do things and he did as much as he could, but eventually he got to the point where he didn't have any more authority or ability to do. He couldn't even appoint a Supreme Court justice without it being countered. But the particular person I'm thinking about, his response to that was, well, he should have been able to. And Trump, that's what we like about Trump. He gets things done. Even if the things are very destructive, this
Yes.
individual see it as he's a person. If he tells you he's going to do it, he does it, whatever that means.
Well, that's not true, but I mean that he actually gets things done. I mean, if you recall the infrastructure week that he promised for the 4 years that he was president, and then
It was
um
infrastructure week every week.
yes, and then Biden went ahead and did it. We have another question. Today in the local Spain, in the newspaper, local Spain, there was a story about how the U.S. Embassy in Madrid is requiring its Spanish suppliers to prove that they don't have or implement company DEI policies. These toxic U.S. policies are already spilling over the other shores and being enforced upon other societies. Can they even do that?
Well, I mean, I, they can certainly do it, but the interesting thing, those companies that are willing to change their DEI policy because some of them say we can have government contracts, so we have to, if we want to keep our contracts, we have to do this. I think the better companies that had an appreciation for DEI because it was making their company a better place, they're going to continue doing what they have been doing and they're not going to look for excuses to turn around because I think those companies that are changing their ways, they wanted an excuse to do it to begin with. Um, DEI helps organizations if it's done properly. It's not just for to be on the books or to say that you've done it. It actually makes the organization a better place.
Yes, I agree. I agree. I don't know. First, I would probably say that I'm not sure. Is there a diversity, equity, and inclusion movement in Spain? I mean, I think that they're implying a lot of American things onto other countries that may or may not exist. Um, it's another question. Dr. Scott, thank you. Do you think the efforts to integrate the military drove the civilian world towards civil rights, or did the civil rights movement in the outside world shape the military, or was it both ways? In
That's
other words, how much influence does the military have over the rest of American society?
that's a great question because when I was a part of the military, my attitude was the military was far ahead of certain parts of the civilian sector, not all, because different states, different parts of the country do things differently. But as far as the South is concerned, I thought the military When they made the decision to do something, it was implemented and people got it done. And when I got out in 1968, I thought for the most part the military was far ahead of the civilian sector, at least certain parts of the civilian sector. So mine is probably a biased view, but I think the military led on that, even though there's still problems in the military till this day.
Yeah, I think they did. I think they did too. I when I worked for the military, in some ways, it was probably one of the most diverse places that I've ever worked. Um, I mean, because it reflects the United States, you know, and we are, whether they like it or not, we are a very diverse country. We have another question. Do you have advice for how to navigate hard conversations surrounding this DEI and general divisive acts? I think you mean, did you mean divisive or diversity in everyday life?
Mm. Do you have any thoughts at all on that while I'm thinking?
Well, I think that dividing, sorry. Okay, got it. I think that yeah, these conversations are hard, but I think that people, if they can understand what DEI means and that it's more than just your race or sex, it's, your whether you have some sort of a disability or that you are maybe even younger, even young people, the idea of an inclusion is to bring people in. And I don't know if I have no idea how old everyone is, but I remember when I had my first job, I worked at a marketing company and everyone was like, "You're so young." And they treated me, even though I knew what I was doing. So, I mean, whether you're younger or older, or you have a disability, or you have maybe even veterans, not everybody wants to hire veterans. I know that people think that it's only because of the laws that a lot of people are even being considered to be hired. Um, it's I think that you have to make people understand that inclusion is also, it's not reverse racism. If there's a company and let's say it's 90% men, and then you hire a woman, it's not taking a job away from a man necessarily. I mean, I don't know. What do you
Okay.
think, Robert?
Yeah, my thoughts, and I wanted you to talk first because the thing that I was going to say, sometimes you just have to have hard conversations. You just have to have them. And when I gave the example of being in the Defense Race Relations Institute, where this one kid said, I just did it to piss you off. But at least they were able to have a dialogue after that got on the table. Sometimes people need to say what they need to say, and they should be encouraged to do it. And if you have something that you need to say, even if it's going to piss somebody off, sometimes you just have to do it, and then you have to work your way from there. But if it never gets said, then you're never going to be able to move forward. So I say sometimes it might not be comfortable. It just has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I used to work in IT and I've never, there's only one place the whole time that I was working in IT where there were more women than men, and that was when I worked at a bank, and our IT department was mostly women for some reason. I don't really understand how that happened, but it did. And so being, I mean, being in the realm of IT with mostly men all the time, I definitely had to always know what I was doing. And so nobody could ever say, oh, if we got rid of this woman. And this is, I mean, I think it's a little bit unfair that men can basically, no offense to all the men out there, men can basically just show up, and it doesn't matter if they're competent or not, but women and other groups of people have to be, totally on point all the time. Um, I think this is just something that they've been saying. It's basically just racism and sexism and homophobia. I mean, it's not that they don't want DEI, because they're using that as a way to limit what people are able to do. Let me see if there's any other questions. Does anybody have any other questions before otherwise we can, yeah, just, oh, here's one. There's so much fear of the other, anyone who's different. As an Asian American, I don't understand why the majority group seems to be defensive or uncomfortable about DEI. Hmm.
Well, I mean, that's the age-old question. People don't like or want change, and if they feel they're in the best position, they don't want that to not be the case. Now, that's like thinking of the world as a zero-sum game, and that is if I have, then you don't. And that's not necessarily the way it is if we're willing to share. If we have the attitude, I have to have most of it, therefore you can't have much of it, then that's problematic. And I think with some of the very, very rich people we have in the country, that's their attitude because the question is how much is too much? Gee whiz. You would think if you've got all of this and there are people who are suffering, that they're, especially if they work for you, and I'm thinking of Amazon, if they work for you, you would think you would share some of it with them. But that there is just the mentality, I think, where some people feel threatened and they feel if you are a part of the process, then they have to lose something and they don't want to lose something.
Yes. So for anybody who's curious, I will be sending out the recording Friday or Saturday. I'm not going to guarantee Friday. I've got a lot of stuff to do. And but for sure by Saturday. And yeah, we will definitely have further discussions about many topics this year. Black History Month is going to be a 12-month event. We will not, I think there's a lot of of history and information that everybody needs to know. And we're not going to let a bunch of ignorant people stop us from disseminating that information. And I'm super glad that I've gotten through this event without swearing. That is my goal for every day since Trump was inaugurated. Um, and I wish everyone a wonderful, happy Black History Month. And we're also going to be our last Black History Month event is going to be on next Sunday. We're having our GBC Cafe, which essentially is where we're going. We have one of these cafes every month, and the cafe is a place where we can all talk, discuss, strategize, just be together, have community, uh, and try to get through this the best that we can. So everyone's invited to come and remember the women's the International Women's Day event, see if your local country committee is doing a march or demonstration, or go to your country committee and say, I want to do a march or a demonstration. Let's arrange one. And I thank you all so much for joining us today. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one, everybody. Thank you so much, Robert.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yes, if something resonated with you, you learned something, or you want to take action.
Stay in touch with the Global Black Caucus. Our link trees in the show notes. And always remember, power to the people.